Hello, I'm Nick, and this is Today in Philosophy of History for Thursday, 30 May 2024. It is the 149th anniversary of the birth of Giovanni Gentile, who was born in Castelvetrano, Italy, on this date in 1875. He was assassinated by communist partisans on 15 April 1944. Gentile is often remembered today as the official philosopher of Italian fascism. In his 1927 paper, The Philosophic Basis of Fascism, Gentile says that, quote, "The authority of the state and the freedom of the citizen constitute a continuous circle wherein authority presupposes liberty and liberty authority. For freedom can only exist within the state, and the state means authority. But the state is not an entity hovering in the air over the heads of its citizens. It is one with the personality of the citizen," unquote. This continuous circle, Gentile believed, was broken by liberalism. Quote, "Liberalism broke the circle above referred to, setting the individual against the state and liberty against authority. What the liberal desired was liberty as against the state, a liberty which was a limitation of the state, though the liberal had to resign himself as the lesser of the evils to a state which was a limitation on liberty. The absurdities inherent in the liberal conception of freedom were apparent to liberals themselves early in the 19th century. It is no merit of fascism to have again indicated them. Fascism has its own solution of the paradox of liberty and authority. The authority of the state is absolute. It does not compromise, it does not bargain, it does not surrender any portion of its field to other moral or religious principles which may interfere with the individual conscience. On the other hand, the state becomes a reality only in the consciousness of its individuals, and the fascist corporative state supplies a representative system more sincere and more in touch with the realities than any other previously devised, and is therefore freer than the old liberal state," unquote. This exposition of Gentile's conception of fascism is, in a sense, embedded within a philosophy of history, as Gentile's argument builds up the development of modern Italian history up to his time as a growing historical crisis and presents fascism as the solution to this crisis. It has been said that Gentile's philosophy of actual idealism played a role in the development of fascism parallel to the role that Marx's historical materialism played in the development of communism. But if we only read Gentile's exposition of fascism, we will miss out on the philosophical idealism and the philosophy of history that brought Gentile to this point. Rick Peters writes of Gentile's conception of history, quote, "L'esperienza pura e la realtà storica," and the chapter on history in Teoria Generale dello Spirito come atto puro were Gentile's two major contributions to the philosophy of history before Sistema di Logica. Taken together, they account for the subjective and the objective dimensions of historical thought. In his Pisan inaugural lecture, Gentile tried to show how the historian, on the basis of his subjective experience of reading a text, reaches a judgment based on his previously formed culture, which may be equated with his education. In the chapter on history in the Teoria Generale, Gentile specifies this notion of culture in terms of ideal eternal history, which is very similar to Gadamer's notion of effective history. Historical judgment can therefore be described as the act of thought which determines an underground that into a what on the basis of historiography. To put it in Gentile's own words, res gestae, deeds done, and historia rerum gestarum, history of the deeds done, coincide. The past exists only in the function of historical thought. From this identity of the res gestae and the historia rerum gestarum, it follows that the sole norm for the objectivity of historical thought is historical thought itself. Outside this, there is nothing because concrete thought does not presuppose a reality outside itself. Concrete thought is completely norma sui, unquote. Gentile's distinction between res gestae and historia rerum gestarum that Peters discusses in this passage is the familiar distinction between history as past actuality and history as the record of past actuality. Gentile collapses this distinction so that the actuality is the record and the record is the actuality. We find this idea of a complete history with no reality outside itself in Gentile's The Theory of Mind as Pure Act. Quote, history is true and effectual reality. When we have understood history by mentally reconstructing its reality, there remains nothing outside it, no reality independent of history by which we can possibly test our reconstruction and decide whether it corresponds or not, unquote. We are already familiar with the identification of philosophy with history from Croce, Gentile's elder contemporary. Gentile takes this idea to in a different direction than Croce. Further along in The Theory of Mind as Pure Act, Gentile says of history, quote, it is commonly supposed that historical positivism stands on the same basis of naturalistic positivism, but it is not the same for the naturalist insofar as he is necessarily a positivist. He must set out with the presupposition that nature is and that it can be known, and his knowability depends on its being, whether its being is known or not. We mean by nature something the mind finds confronting it, something already realized when we are brought into relation with it. And positivism is nothing but the philosophy which conceives reality as fact, independent of any relation to the mind which studies it. History presents, indeed, in the positive character of its events, an analogy with nature, but its intelligibility consists in the unity of the real to which it belongs on the one side, and in the mentality of the historian on the other. The history of the past is impossible if it is found unintelligible, if, for example, it is attested by undecipherable documents. Between the personages of history and ourselves, there must be a common language, a common mentality, an identity of problems, of interests, of thought. This means that it must pertain to one and the same world with ourselves, to one and the same process of reality. History, therefore, is not already realized when we set out on our historical research. It is our own life in act. If then nature is nature so far only as it precedes the thought of nature, history is history insofar as it is only the thought of the historian, unquote. Rick Peters, again, makes a particularly telling observation about Gentile's conception of history that is ripe for interpretation and extrapolation. Quote, it is on the basis of this history, of the idea of history, says Gentile, that Mommsen rightly claimed that he knew more about Roman history than Livy. After all, Mommsen had thought more, and that, according to Gentile, is equivalent to saying that in the 19 centuries that separated Livy from Mommsen, the human spirit had thought more. This example shows that Gentile identifies objectivity with intersubjectivity. Mommsen's history of Rome is more objective than Livy's because his account of Rome's history takes into account the entire historiography, including the principles on which it is based from Livy to the 19th century, unquote. Several of Gentile's systematic works have been translated to English. Unfortunately, his Sistema di Logica come teoria del conoscere is not one of them. And Gentile's remark about Mommsen is in the second volume of his work on logic and the theory of knowledge. This can be approximately and certainly imperfectly rendered thus. Quote, Mommsen will say that he knows more about the most ancient history of Rome than Livy, and he will tell the truth. But why? He thought more. He, the human spirit, which is not only Theodore Mommsen, but that spirit which in 19 centuries matures its historical categories, its penetration of documentary material, always seeks and thinks, always dissatisfied and reflects, and finally writes the history of Rome as an act of thought that makes all the previous ones obsolete. And by making them so, gives them a value which would be null if all interest in the history of Roman civilization and Mommsen had suddenly disappeared, and, for example, he had spent his life as an entomologist, unquote. Like I said, that's a very imperfect rendering of Gentile's Italian into English. But I quote it because it is an idea that has troubled me for a long time, something I've thought about for many years. And I've tried to come at it from different perspectives to get a handle on exactly what the problem is. So who knows more about Roman history, Mommsen or Livy? Who was Mommsen? Well, Mommsen was a 19th century German classical historian He wrote many books, A Long History of Rome, a work on Roman epigraphy, and a work on Roman law. But he was also, in another sense, in a relevant sense here, a scholar living 1,500 years after the end of Roman civilization who wrote about the Romans. But Mommsen's erudition in Roman history was so great that he came to be used by other historians as a symbol of historical erudition. For example, he entered into the Carr-Elton debate and was batted back and forth like a tennis ball between the two. So here's what David Carr, Edward Hallett Carr, I should say. David Carr is a phenomenologist. Sorry about that. Here's what E.H. Carr had to say about Mommsen. Quote, I have no patience with the fashion set by Bury in his inaugural lecture of pretending that Mommsen's greatness rests not on his history of Rome, but on his corpus of inscriptions and his work on Roman constitutional law. This is to reduce history to the level of compilation, unquote. That's just a short outtake. He goes on like that for 3 pages, more or less. And to that, Geoffrey Elton, in The Practice of History, wrote about Carr, about Mommsen, quote, his, meaning Carr's, exasperated complaint shows no sign that he grasped what Mommsen achieved when he laid the solid foundations of Latin epigraphy, or of the kind of organizing and analyzing genius in the writing of the 3 large volumes of the Staatsrecht. The sheer learning and expository skill displayed in these works exemplify historical insight and achievement of the highest order. To recognize this, which need not induce one to deprecate the sweep and grandeur of the history of Rome, should, in the working historian, call forth an awed admiration for greatness in his own line of work, unquote. So that's Elton on Mommsen. So who was Livy? If Mommsen was a 19th century classical historian, who was Livy? Well, Livy was one of the greatest of the Roman historians. He lived in the 1st century BC and wrote a large work on the history of Rome from its foundations. In its final form, I think it was 42 volumes, of which 30-some remain to the present day extant. And in contradistinction to Mommsen, who was a modern man writing about ancient Roman civilization long gone, Livy was a Roman writing about Roman civilization. And interestingly enough, Livy wrote about the questions of later historians knowing more than earlier historians. So from the very first page of the first book of his history, Livy wrote, quote, every writer on history tends to look down his nose at his less cultivated predecessors, happily persuaded that he will be better than them in point of style or bring new facts to light, unquote. So this isn't anything new. It's been around for a while, although the justification has become much more elaborate and systematic. Collingwood also jumped into the question of who knew more about history, once again invoking Mommsen as a symbol. So in Collingwood's, I think it's a 1930 essay simply titled Philosophy of History, he wrote, quote, everyone brings his own mind to the study of history and approaches it from the point of view which is characteristic of himself and his generation. Naturally, therefore, one age, one man seen in particular historical events which another does not, and vice versa. This does not reduce history to something arbitrary or capricious. It remains genuine knowledge. How can this be if my thoughts about Julius Caesar differ from Mommsen's? Must not one of us be wrong? No, because the object differs. My historical thought is about my own past, not about Mommsen's past. Mommsen and I share a great many things, and in many respects we share a common past. But insofar as we are different people and representatives of different cultures and different generations, we have behind us different pasts, and everything in his past has to undergo a slight alteration before it can enter into mine. Quite apart then from any error in his or my interpretation of the evidence, our views of Julius Caesar must differ, perhaps slightly, but perceptibly. This difference is not arbitrary, for I can see, or one ought to be able to see, that in his place, apart once more from all question of error, I should have come to his conclusions, unquote. So Collingwood is effectively saying there that every historian in constructing history constructs another history. So there are essentially as many histories as there are historians. Now, fortunately, there's a convergence. But if we wanted to be uncharitable in our interpretation of Collingwood, we could say that history just almost randomly branches out with every historian who writes a history. And Collingwood is known as an idealist philosopher of history, though an idealist in the tradition of English philosophy, not in the tradition of German philosophy. There's very little hint of Kant, Fichte, Schelling, or Hegel in Collingwood. But he was an idealist of sorts. He thought that history was the reenactment of past thoughts in the mind of the historian or of anybody who reads history. Gentile's idealism was more thoroughgoing than Collingwood, so Gentile arguably goes further down the idealist rabbit hole than Collingwood did. He also runs into the problems of an idealist account of historical knowledge in a more radical way than was forced upon Collingwood. Although I just said that with Collingwood, we could say that he is effectively allowing any number of histories, as many as histories as there are historians. They differ, like he said, a little bit, but they do differ. So, and they're all presumably legitimate histories. I won't go into that further, but that's an interesting question in and of itself that deserves further reflection and development. And of course, Gentile's claim about Mommsen was little more than a remark in passing in the exposition of an idealist theory of knowledge, and it would probably be a mistake to read too much into it. But I want to pursue it further here because of the intrinsic interest of the epistemological problems that result from collapsing the res gestae into the historia rerum gestarum. What is at stake here is the meaning of knowledge, and more narrowly, the meaning of historical knowledge. Livy had a knowledge of Roman history that no modern scholar ever has possessed or ever could possess, which is the lived experience, to use a term of Dilthey, of Roman history. Livy's Roman history is a Roman history written by a Roman. Mommsen no doubt had an absolute knowledge of Roman history that exceeded that of Livy in terms of any objective quantification of knowledge, but he had no lived experience of Roman history. And there's an interesting epistemological problem here. Philosophers sometimes distinguish between knowing that and knowing how. Knowing that is also called propositional knowledge because this kind of knowledge can be explicitly formulated in propositions. We have propositional knowledge, for example, that the Eiffel Tower is a tall structure in Paris that was designed by Gustave Eiffel. Knowing how, in contrast to knowing that, is the knowledge of how to do something, and it is resistant to formulation in explicitly stated propositions. Often, knowing how takes the form of a skill, and it usually requires the practice of an activity. For example, I know how to efficiently split wood with an axe because I've been doing it all my life. But it wouldn't be very helpful for me to stand beside you and tell you how to split wood. It'd be much more effective for you to actually pick up an axe and try to split a piece of wood. And if you did it for a while, you would catch on pretty quickly. It's not difficult. But that is knowing how as opposed to knowing that. One of the reasons knowing how is resistant to formalization as propositional knowledge is because it's an instance of what the philosopher Michael Polanyi called tacit knowledge, which is knowledge that we have but which we can't explain. Recognizing faces is like this. When we recognize the face of a friend in the crowd, we don't know exactly how we do recognize a familiar face, and we can't do a good job of explaining how to recognize a given face in the crowd. If you ask someone to tell you how to find somebody in the crowd, they usually explain their hairstyle or the clothing they're wearing or something like that. Explaining, somebody would have to have very unusual facial features to be able to describe how to find them in a crowd, and it probably wouldn't be very flattering, to be blunt about it. We could also postulate a form of knowledge that we could call knowing why, in contrast to knowing that and knowing how, which I would call explanatory knowledge. Even if we know that Gustav Eiffel designed the Eiffel Tower, we don't necessarily know why he designed the Eiffel Tower, nor why the Parisians built the Eiffel Tower. Knowing the explanation for propositional knowledge could then be called knowing why or explanatory knowledge, which would be a subdivision of propositional knowledge, because we can explicitly formulate it in propositions if we have taken our theory of explanation far enough, if we've effectively developed it. Aristotle would have called this knowledge of final causes in his schematism of the 4 kinds of causes. But this epistemological taxonomy that I've run by you so far of knowing how, knowing that, and knowing why, still leaves us with a classification for the kind of knowledge that we uniquely get from lived experience, and which you do not have if you do not have lived experience. We could call this immersive knowledge, since it's the kind of knowledge that a fish would have of living in water. I mention that example because David Foster Wallace gave a speech, which was subsequently published as a short book titled "This is Water." And in part, the speech is about the problem of recognizing that one is immersed in water if, like a fish, one's life has been lived entirely in water and you don't know anything else but living in water. And I might mention as a side note, it's really interesting to look at the reaction to David Foster Wallace's speech, since it has inspired really antithetical responses. Some people think it's very profound, but other people regard it as laughably shallow. And so it's worth listening to the speech and reflecting on it. I would point out that a lot of philosophical questions are exactly like this. They are things that some people regard as profound and other people see as laughably shallow and not worth their time. We can also come at this idea of immersive knowledge from another angle. Wittgenstein, in his Philosophical Remarks, which is one of his transitional manuscripts between the Tractatus and the Philosophical Investigations, wrote that nothing contrasts with the form of the world. I've been fascinated with that remark, and I wrote a blog post about it some years ago. I think of it as a metaphysical way of making a similar point to that of David Foster Wallace. And we can take it as a distinctive property of immersive knowledge that we have nothing with which to contrast it, because it is the only thing of its kind that we know. In any case, I don't think that immersive knowledge is a very good term, and I don't have a perfect term at present. So for the moment, I'm going to call it presuppositional knowledge, which is also awkward, but I think it's a little better than immersive knowledge. So presuppositional knowledge, as I'm going to define it here, is knowledge of the presuppositions of propositional knowledge, which is derived from lived experience. That's not perfect, but it's better than nothing. And at least now we have a classification for knowledge derived from lived experience. With these epistemological preliminaries out of the way, we can ask again the question of who knows more about Roman history. Livy, who possessed both propositional knowledge and presuppositional knowledge of Roman history, or Mommsen, who possessed only propositional knowledge of Roman history. This question suggests a thought experiment. In fact, it suggests several thought experiments as we try to probe the nature of historical knowledge from different points of view. A citizen of Byzantium in the 14th century could have looked back on the history of Rome as 19 centuries of continuous history, of which he might have counted himself a part. Compare this to the perspective of the 20th century scholar, or even the 19th century scholar like Mommsen, who was writing about events 1900 years removed from him. But in the 20th century, or I should say the 21st century, as I still think in terms of 20th century because I'm from the 20th century, or the 19th century, like Mommsen, we do not understand ourselves as being part of this tradition of Roman history. We might imagine ourselves as being part of Western civilization, and Roman civilization is a part of Western civilization, but we don't see ourselves as Romans, like the Byzantines saw themselves as Romans. Certainly, the lived experience of a late Byzantine historian would have been radically different from the lived experiences of Livy, but would it be as different from Livy as we see ourselves from Livy? We can take this thought experiment much further if we consider our relative proximity to historical events that we typically perceive as being very distant from us, hence very alien and difficult to understand. So let me give you some examples of what I mean. When I listened to the Great Courses lectures by Arnold Weinstein, Understanding Literature and Life, Drama, Poetry, and Narrative, I noticed an interesting illustration of our unexpected intimacy with the distant past in his lecture 42, Chrétien de Troyes l'Éveil, Growing Up in the Middle Ages. In the setup to this section of a course on narrative, Weinstein in lecture 41 discusses perennial issues of authorial intent and how we read old books today in light of our knowledge of the contemporary world. When he passes on to reading medieval literature in lecture 42, we are prepared for his observation of how distant in time the later writers of the Arthurian romances were from the events that they narrated, and even from the first narration of these events, so that our later reading of the text is no more alien to the original than the writing of the text. The historical Arthur, if there was an historical Arthur, lived on the cusp of late antiquity and the early medieval world. Our classic source on Arthur, which is Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regnum Britanniae, History of the Kings of Britain, was completed about 1136 AD, so it dates from about 600 years after the historical Arthur, if there was a historical Arthur. Sir Thomas Malory's Mort d'Arthur, The Death of Arthur, was published by Caxton in 1485, and it was among the last of the Arthurian romances. It dates from about 300 years later than Geoffrey of Monmouth's history. Almost 1,000 years intervenes between the historical Arthur and Malory's work. Malory, in fact, is closer to us in history than he was to Arthur in history, if there was, again, a historical Arthur. So King Arthur seems a very distant figure to us. We can't even ascertain his historicity. But Arthur was also a distant figure to Geoffrey of Monmouth and Sir Thomas Malory. And given the state of historical record keeping between Arthur, if there was an Arthur, and Geoffrey of Monmouth, we could even argue that the gulf between them is greater because of the lack of information and lack of sources. In terms of absolute temporal distance, we ought to enjoy a greater intimacy with Sir Thomas Malory than Malory enjoyed with Arthur. But there is another sense in which Geoffrey of Monmouth and Thomas Malory were closer to Arthur than we were, and that is that all of them belonged more or less to the same era of civilization, which is medieval Western civilization. So they shared a certain outlook, or at least they shared a part of a certain outlook, if we take the medieval millennium to have an overlapping continuity in which those from the earliest parts would have something in common with those of the latest parts of this periodization. So following this logic, it's possible that two individuals separated by 1,000 years might have more in common than two individuals that are separated by just 100 or 200 years. And this does at times seems to be the case. In fact, we can even leap over the Middle Ages, and in reading the authors of classical antiquity, the modern Westerner is usually much more at home than he is in medieval literature, which always has a very alien feel to it. We can read Tacitus and Ovid as contemporaries, whereas Richard Rolle or Walter Hilton don't read like contemporaries at all. And in my recent episode on Ibn Khaldun, I made a similar point when I said that we can read the authors of the Islamic Golden Age, like Ibn Khaldun and Ibn Battuta and Ibn Fadlan, as contemporaries more readily than we can read the literature of medieval Europe. We would need a mature science of history, and today we don't even have an immature science of history, to express this idea with the requisite precision by quantifying the differences and similarities within and between civilizations. It might be possible to express this informal idea of relative historical proximity in a formal language if we were able to develop that. From there, if we had that, we might be able to extrapolate these findings to a million-year-old civilization or even a billion-year-old civilization, for which temporal distance will become a much more vexing problem even than it is for us today, looking back on a few thousand years, 6,000 years of recorded history at most. One way to approach this problem more formally would be by way of Arthur Danto's treatment of the logic of narrative sentences, which I mentioned in my episode on Arthur Danto. Traditional humanistic historiography has been formulated in terms of narrative sentences, so that the logic of historical sentences, the logic of narrative sentences has governed the construction of histories. And this is by way of contrast with an ideal chronicler who would produce a perfect chronicle of everything that happens as it happens, but who does not employ any narrative sentences, because Danto showed that the meaning of events in the past changes as they are contextualized by further historical developments at later times. It's only in hindsight that we can construct a narrative sentence that references two separate points of time in relation to each other. Or, as Hegel put it, the owl of Minerva takes flight only with the setting of the sun. The examples that Danto employs are typical examples from humanistic narrative history, but Danto's point can be extended to a more comprehensive conception of history that extends human history by embedding it into the scale of time that has been made available to human knowledge by scientific history. This scale of time is vast in comparison to the few thousand years of recorded history preserved only since human societies became literate. Scientific history picks up where humanistic historiography leaves off, with prehistory and by means of archaeology, anthropology, biology, geology, climatology, and cosmology, which extend the range of historical thinking all the way to the beginning to the end of the history of the universe itself. So I touched on this in my episode on a complexity ladder for big history, since big history makes use of the perspective of scientific history in just this way. The idea of history has not only been extended from humanistic history in the tradition of Thucydides to scientific history, the scientific approach to history has also contributed experimental archaeology to the understanding of history, in which contemporary scientists attempt to recreate the circumstances of history in order to understand it better. We can think of this as a more or less natural extension of the scientific method, not only to theorize on the basis of empirical data, but also to engage in experiments on the basis of historical data. So in this spirit, scientists have worked on their flint knapping skills and have made arrowheads and spearheads and have dressed carcasses with flint blades and have attempted to construct or reconstruct early structures using the same tools and resources as people who originally constructed buildings that have been found in archaeological excavations, for example. The spirit of experimental archaeology as a reconstruction of the past is found in a number of endeavors that range from the historically informed performance movement in music, where performers try to recreate the conditions of performance of early music using early instruments and trying to, by archival research, discover what performances were like, to the restoration and especially the reconstruction of historical buildings. So it's much wider than just some archaeologists, anthropologists learning how to make an arrowhead out of flint. It's really a broadly based effort to try to understand the reconstruction of the past. And this presents us with several interesting philosophical questions and also practical questions, because we have to ask, how far should reconstruction efforts go? After the end of the Second World War, this philosophical question became one of intensely practical import for Europe, because a large proportion of the European continent was largely wrecked by the fighting of the Second World War. Whereas World War I was mostly fought in rural areas and in trenches, World War II was fought in and through and around cities. Germany especially had most of its major cities flattened by the air war. which I discussed in my episode on the bombing of Dresden. I have a book called Lost Treasures of Europe. It's not difficult to find in the used book market, that consists of black and white before and after pictures of Europe and European cities before and after the Second World War. And it's heartbreaking to look through the book to see how much was lost. But then you can also look back and see now in the 21st century how much has been reconstructed. There's been a major reconstructive effort in Dresden since the end of the communist regime in Eastern Germany, and even the Frauenkirche was rebuilt there, that had just sat in ruins for decades. Different European cities took different approaches to historical reconstruction after the Second World War. Just like I said, Dresden was largely rebuilt as a modern city, and then now, decades later, they're starting to rebuild historical parts of the city. The old center of Warsaw was meticulously reconstructed from old photographs, plans, and memories. And similarly, the historic center of Frankfurt, the Römerberg, was meticulously reconstructed. But this reconstruction is just a tiny little area of reconstructed buildings within an overwhelmingly modern cityscape that surrounds it. In Cologne, parts of the famous city hall were reconstructed, but not all of the historical elements of the building. Similarly, the famous central town square, the Andreasplatz of Hildesheim, a city which was of great historical importance in the early Middle Ages, was partially reconstructed immediately after the war, with some modern buildings and a limited historical reconstruction of the town hall. Eventually, it was decided to rebuild some of the more elaborate timber frame structures that surrounded the Hildesheim's Andreasplatz more than 30 years after it had been partially reconstructed with the modern buildings. The modern buildings were taken down, and the guild halls of the bakers and the butchers were rebuilt on the spot that they had previously stood on decades before they were destroyed and had been there for hundreds of years. The town hall wasn't reconstructed with full historical accuracy, but the town center is once again a showpiece, albeit a reconstructed showpiece, though not the rest of the city. For example, outside the Andreasplatz, there's an important historical building called the Kaiserhaus. It was only the reconstruction of which was only very limited and partial. So I mention all these particular examples because I've traveled to these places and seen them for myself, because I have an interest in medieval architecture, and I've gone to see a great many examples in various places in Europe. To some people, historical reconstruction or historically informed performance in music seems forced and artificial. The argument is that the building tradition or the performance tradition has been lost, so what we are seeing or hearing is only our imagination of what the past would have been like. So the claim here is that the past is completely irretrievable, and we should basically give up trying. My response to that is that the reproduction is not perfect, but it would be arbitrary and nihilistic to try to hold that the reconstruction holds no relationship at all to the original. Once we acknowledge that there is a relationship between the original and the reproduction, it's a natural human response to try to close the gap and make the reproduction as close as possible to the original. And once we take a larger historical view, the historically informed performance of Bach or the reconstruction of the Butcher's Guild House in Hildesheim doesn't really seem so outrageous. Compared to what we know of, for example, of classical antiquity, the medieval and early modern past is relatively familiar to us. I don't think it would be too much to say that someone making an intensive study of these periods might be able to at least partially recover the Weltanschauung of these people, and thus some of the spirit with which they invested their works that remain as a legacy to us, albeit in a fragmentary form. At historical sites of classical antiquity, the reconstruction has mostly been limited to stacking up a few columns where the column drums were still available on the ground, and not going much beyond that. There are a few exceptions to that, but mostly that's the limit of reconstruction of ancient buildings. Our knowledge of Greek and Roman architecture is not nearly on a level with our knowledge of medieval German architecture, as we have intact examples of the latter to guide us, and very few of classical antiquity as a guide to construction. I think that there will come a day in the distant future when our distant descendants will be grateful to us that we took the trouble to attempt to restore and reconstruct part of the past to the extent that we have been able to, making good some of our war damage, given our proximity to the past in comparison to distant futurity, and our likely superior understanding of the past in comparison to their understanding. That is to say, what the people in the far distant future would be able to understand of what is to us only a few hundred years away. While we think of our civilization as something very aged and old, from a future perspective of a million or a billion-year-old civilization, all that human civilization has achieved to date may appear as mere prologue to real or authentic civilization that only gets underway once a civilization passes some given threshold that we haven't even met yet. So we're only now coming up onto symbolic firsts of, say, the space age, something that I discussed in my episode on the coming coeval age. There are symbolic firsts, like the first artificial satellite, which was Sputnik, and the first human beings on the moon, which was the Apollo mission. If we regard, that spacefaring threshold as the threshold of a properly modern civilization, then everything else that comes before it is prehistory. We call prehistory everything that comes before the written record, but future historians a million years from now may see things rather different and may choose a different advent for the beginning of history, properly speaking, history in the strict sense as they might think of it. So we might be much closer to the beginning than to the end of civilization. If civilization ends tomorrow, if there's a nuclear war and that's all, folks, then we're much closer to the end. But if civilization survives for a million years, then we're much closer to the beginning than we are close to the end. Imagine a human civilization 10,000 years from now. We would likely do a better job of understanding and reconstructing the medieval and early modern past, who are removed from us by a few hundred years, or our distant descendants, which are removed from it by thousands of years, and at very least further removed from this past than we are. This process of contextualizing the distant past in a more comprehensive historical scope can be iterated even further out into the future. It's a matter of acquiring temporal perspective. So imagine human civilization another order of magnitude older, 100,000 years from now. We are only 2,000 years distant from classical antiquity, and therefore on a relatively intimate terms with the past in comparison with the world of 100,000 AD. If you ask a typical man in the street of 100,000 AD, which came first, the American Empire or the Roman Empire, they honestly might not know their names and dates and places of history well enough to say off the top of their head. They might hesitate with a mild sense of embarrassment, not remember the answer to a question they had learned in school. For us, the difference between Rome and America is pretty obvious and easy to grasp, but that will not always be true. If you go far enough ahead in the future, there is not so much difference between the typical Roman and the typical American, and they might easily be mistaken the one for the other. If we continue this line of reasoning, it might be reasonable to suppose that human civilization of 100 million AD, or whatever constitutes the successors to human beings and human civilization 100 million years from now, might be grateful to us that we developed an interest in our origins as early as we did in the evolution of our species, since we made an effort to collect and document the earliest human ancestors as soon as we did before more of it was lost. We are now only 2 or 3 million years removed from the bones of our ancestors that were found in the Oldovai Gorge, and that puts us on relatively intimate terms with our ancestors compared to those who will come many millions of years later. So, to switch gears pretty considerably, when Job was interrogated by the voice out of the whirlwind, he was given what we could call a Copernican lesson in his cosmological insignificance. Where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare, if thou hast understanding, who hath laid the measures thereof, if thou knowest, or who hath stretched the line upon it? Whereupon are the foundations thereof fastened, and who laid the cornerstone thereof? When the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy. Well, as it turns out, and perhaps counterintuitively, human beings are not far away in terms from temporal distance from when the foundations of the earth were laid. Whether we take our lessons in cosmological insignificance from the Old Testament or from the ascetic ideals of modern science in the form of the Copernican principle, our relative proximity to the origins of the universe and the origins of our planet follows logically from the smallness of man in the universe. The universe is only some 13.7 billion years old, and its projected lifespan is many orders of magnitude older than the age of the universe today. Insofar as we can rely on our contemporary knowledge of cosmology, which is, of course, imperfect, we are, relatively speaking, quite close to the origins of the universe, and we could be perceived as being witnesses of the immediate aftermath of these origins by some observer situated in the far future of cosmological history near the heat death of the universe. Only a few billion years separate us from the origins of the universe, and that puts us on relatively intimate terms with those events as compared to observers who will come later, if there are any observers. This was one of the points made by Lawrence Krauss and Robert J. Scherer in their paper on the end of cosmology thesis. After all the galaxies have passed over the cosmological horizon, and our descendants, if any, find themselves in an isolated island universe, they will not be able to see the observational pillars of the Big Bang and Big Bang cosmology, and thus will not be able to reconstruct the history of the universe in which they find themselves as we have been able to do. Since Krauss and Scherer advanced their thesis, Abraham Loeb has argued that the observation of hypervelocity stars will be able to reveal the structures of the cosmos that will betray its origins. But obviously, it's a dicey question. Nevertheless, the further we are removed from the origins of the universe, the more difficult it becomes to reconstruct those origins. Our relative proximity to the origins of the universe arguably makes us privileged observers, so that we can, in all honesty, say that we were not far from the scene when the foundations of the earth were laid. So we've come a long ways. I started off talking about Giovanni Gentile's idealism, and from there took up the problem of who knows more about history, those who live in it and those who write about it years or centuries or millennia later. And this took me on to a naturalistic account of our place in cosmological history. The naturalistic context in which I have formulated the problem of our knowledge of history would have been utterly foreign to Gentile. But what interests me is that whether we come to this from the point of view of the idealist reconstruction of history or from the point of view of scientific history, the result is ultimately not all that different. There is a common constructivism inherent in the idealism and science. Whether we are reconstructing the world on the basis of idealism or on the basis of naturalism, it is in either case a human reconstruction, and we can't entirely escape the human, all too human consequences of being the kind of beings that we are. So happy birthday, Giovanni Gentile, and thanks for listening.